Hey guys, Yui is having some, a problem of real life issues, so Globe and I decided to do something a little bit extra. We're gonna go through the novel series that I haven't actually really touched on, and then, I'll be posting these as bonus videos in and around the actual videos. We're still...
Do it!
This is probably gonna go up before where we actually are in the story, so, we are ahead of where the actual videos are in the next field study place. So I'm just gonna gloss over that, and we're just gonna ignore anything that we're seeing here. Don't worry about any of that.
Just your classic hotel lobby.
Yeah. And we're just gonna dive into Red Moon Rose, which I haven't read, and obviously Globe hasn't read because he's never seen this game before. Red Moon Rose, Chapter 1, page 1 of 18. Our story begins in Erebonia, during the Middle Ages, some 200 years ago. The War of the Lions had concluded in western Zemuria, and Emperor Drycles, a driving force behind its resolution, had been deceased for over a decade. So that gives us a little bit of context.
They just made Sumeria with a Z, didn't they?
Isn't it Sumeria?
No, it is, but
So they flipped a couple of vowels and changed the Z, S to a Z, yes. Sure.
I've always wondered if that's if there's a, not an algorithm, but if there's
sure.
Sort of
Maybe.
equation of how to make something sound like it's a place, half familiarity, half different.
I'm sure that linguists have investigated that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the War of the Lions was 250 years ago, so this is slightly after that, still in the Middle Ages. The imperial capital, Heimdall, was a beautiful traditional city with rows of cheerful red brick buildings that had earned it the name the Vermilion Capital. And we actually saw that. It is definitely Vermilion. There's a lot of red brick. In one back alley of the city, however, a solemn mood reigned. Soldiers in military uniforms paced up and down while a crowd of onlookers gathered to see what was going on. Oh, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do.
Come on, man, I can't read that fast.
They clung to the edges of the scene, refusing to disperse no matter how many times they were asked. At the center of the commotion lay a young woman. Her skin was shockingly pale, as if not a drop of blood ran through her veins. On her neck, 2 dark red spots stood out in stark contrast to the pallid flesh. What do we think happened?
Zombie?
No blood, 2 marks on her neck.
Oh, vampire.
Seeing this, a middle-aged soldier let out a loud sigh and took out his pocket watch. It was just after 6. He gave a curt nod to his subordinates to find out who she was, and the woman's body was swiftly carried away from the curious stares of the gawkers. After watching her safely borne away, he noticed a younger soldier following the woman with eyes as well. Alphonse. He tapped the young man on his shoulder. The soldier started, seeming to realize that he was still on duty. Ah, sorry, Gerard? Okay.
Yep.
Somewhat flustered, Alphonse adjusted his beret, then hung his head apologetically. Though snapped from his reverie, it was clear he still had something on his mind. I believe I told you before to address me as Sir while on duty. I am your commanding officer, after all, Gerard said jokingly. With a fond pat on the shoulder, Gerard reminded him to stay focused, and then left to give orders to the rest of his subordinates. Alphonse quickly returned to his post, silently grateful for Gerard's characteristically thoughtful gesture. Watching this exchange was another young soldier the same age as Alphonse. Scowling unpleasantly, he gave an audible tut. The girl's untimely demise, though shocking, was but one in a series of grisly murders that were the talk of the town. Most of the victims were young women who had been out at night, and they had all met their ends through loss of blood. Or, put another way, the victims had died after having all of the blood drained from their bodies.
Jack the Ripper.
Pretty much. Jack the Ripper vis-a-vis vampire.
Yeah.
Or by way of vampire. Furthermore, all of the bodies which had been found had something else in common. Each had bite marks on their neck as if they had been pierced by incredibly sharp fangs. It didn't take long for word of this to start start to spread among the people of Heimdall, and all who heard the rumors were quick to think of one of the many ancient legends which had existed in Erebonia. Specifically, the legend that had described immortal monstrous creatures which roamed the land at night, feeding on the blood of humans. It was these very legends that eventually became the inspiration for the mass killing's new moniker, the Vampire Murders. That night, after his duties were complete, Alphonse made his way to a small tavern tucked away in a corner of the capital by the name of Algeria to enjoy a late evening meal. As he sat down to his dinner, a pretty girl near his age with a glossy chestnut ponytail studied him with obvious concern. "So how was it, Alfie?" Alfie? Is it nice? I hope so. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. She must be talking about the meal.
Yeah.
The girl, Luca, had been Alphonse's friend since his arrival in Heimdall about 10 years before.
Childhood friend!
A shy, nervous smile tugged at her lips as she continued to watch him. Alphonse felt a hot blush creep up his neck under her intense gaze, but he forced himself to eat. The beef stew she had made had a simple yet comforting taste to it. "Yeah," he assured her, "it's really good. You've really got the hang of this." Luca relaxed at his words, and with a few quick, self-conscious glances at the rest of the tavern customers, she seated herself opposite him. Her courage seemed spent after this gesture, though, and they sat in awkward silence for some time until she managed a hesitant, "How's work these days?" Going these days. At the word work, Alphonse's hand, which was carrying food to his mouth, instantly came to a halt. Despite the so-called vampire murders going on for quite some time, they had been unable to...
So they know the term vampire.
Well, I mean, if it's a series of murders, they would have heard what the news has been calling them. Like, if rumors have been circulating, I'm sure the soldiers have heard of them.
Gotcha. I guess. Okay. I was just wondering if, like, that type of lore was existent in...
I mean, didn't the... Like, everyone in London, including the police, knew the name Jack the Ripper, right? Or Jack, or whatever?
Yes.
The Ripper murders,
I guess for me is just...
called.
Oh, I guess they're not actually saying, like, a vampire did this. They're just...
No.
Somehow just came up with the same word, vampire. I guess.
Yeah, okay, well, everyone's been saying, hey, this looks like it could be vampires. Let's call these the Vampire Murders. There's no evidence to support it, but they're going with it. So, despite the so-called vampire murders going on for quite some time, they had been unable to find a single clue to the culprit behind it all. The corpse of the woman from that afternoon flashed across his mind's eye, and the pleasant flavor of the stew died on his tongue. Ooh. So young. She must have had family, friends, perhaps even a partner, just like anyone else. She had had her whole life ahead of her, and yet that life had been brought to a sudden end, just like so many others before her. What the criminal had done was unforgivable, but the reprehensible nature of the crimes wasn't the only reason that Alphonse was obsessed with the case. Though, sadly for him, there was very little that he could do to solve it now that he had been removed from the investigation team. That's not good.
Oh.
Luca's soft voice brought him back from his thoughts. You were saying?
However will our hero catch the bad guy?
Right, of course. Alfie, just don't go overdoing it, okay? Her kind words made Alphonse realize how tense his expression must have become. Her concern embarrassed him. "I'm fine, honestly," he said in what he hoped was a reassuring voice. Alphonse was a member of a unit of the Imperial Army, popularly known as the Gerard Team, which was responsible for maintaining the law and order in Heimdall. Gerard, the team's commanding officer, had long cared for Alphonse like a father, and it was his recommendation that led Alphonse to join the army and become a member of the team. Since then, he lived in a dormitory near the army's guardhouse. His meal at the tavern finished, he sketched Luca a quick goodbye, and took his usual route towards the dormitory. An eerie, red-colored moon hung full in the sky, bathing the brick buildings in a bewitching carmine glow. Walking alone, Alphonse couldn't help but notice that the number of people on the streets at night was much smaller of late. considering the culprit behind the vampire murder still hadn't been found, that was hardly surprising. And yet, despite the fact that barely anyone dared to take to the streets, new victims kept appearing one after another, as if to mock the soldiers who patrolled the dead of night to keep them safe. The sense of fear in the city increased by the day, and was a deep unease shared by all, even by the soldiers. Silently, he swore himself yet again that he would stop at nothing to catch who was responsible and bring them to justice. Now he's a vigilante. Suddenly, Alphonse stopped in his tracks, his troubled thoughts interrupted by the sight of an unaccompanied woman walking ahead of him. The deep shadows blanketing the path made it difficult to be certain, but she seemed unsteady on her feet. To his further surprise, she then turned and disappeared down an even darker back alley. Womp womp.
Yeah.
Considering the ongoing vampire murders, it was hard to believe that anyone could be so careless. With a resolute air, Alphonse set about following the woman, determined to call out to her and try to prevent her from coming to any harm. He entered the back alley.
Uh-oh.
Gloom obscured all but the sharpest angles. He squinted, willing his eyes to adjust. The soft outline of a woman's back took shape in the depths of the alley. Excuse me, I'm yawning.
Gonna die.
Excuse me, miss. I'm not sure it's wise to be... Alphonse forgot what he was about to say. Something was wrong. Slowly, the woman turned to face him. Her head hung limply to the side, her long hair masking her face. A hint of eyes could be seen through the wild locks, but they held no focus, no awareness. She opened her mouth and moaned. Horrified by the disturbing figure before him, Alphonse froze. In an instant, she was on him. Arms outstretched, she lunged and seized his neck in a crushing grip. Taken, but completely by surprise, he fell backwards, the weight of her pinning him down. Slowly, methodically, she began to squeeze. Gah! He croaked. How could this seemingly lifeless woman be capable of such unnatural strength? No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pry her hands from around his windpipe. All his training, all his youthful strength, none of it seemed to count for anything against those unyielding claws. Her fingers dug deeper still, and the already painful absence of air became indescribable agony. From his low vantage point, Alphonse was able to see more of the woman's face now. It swam in and out of his oxygen-starved brain, but her pale flesh was almost luminous against the darkness of the night. Her lips were chapped and colorless. As she squeezed, they began to part in a hungry leer, the edges splitting. Dinner! Although Alphonse could barely understand what was happening, his instincts knew exactly what the woman was about to do. He bucked and writhed desperately in her grip, but her hold was too great. Black began seeping into his vision. Even as he remembered the saber belted to his waist, he was too weak to draw it. The blank-eyed woman thrust her face eagerly towards his neck, teeth bared and mouth yawning wide. Alphonse began to close his eyes. Death seemed his only choice. But just then, the world in his fading view exploded. Dum 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 dum. Alright, that is chapter 1.
I'm mildly interested so far.
Yeah.
Like,
there's some good setup. Our hero's kind of an idiot, but you know,
very much an idiot.
The plot is intriguing, let's say.
Yes.
I am intrigued about the red moon and the vampire murder and what's happening in Erebonia. Not too keen on Alphonse, but that happens.
But I mean that is what it is.
Yeah. All right, chapter 2.
Protagonists are very often not actually the favorite.
Sometimes you're
character of most people.
Okay, chapter 2, Vampire Hunter. As the world blurred, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a geometric shape pass before his eyes. It was the sole of a boot moving at incredible speed. With a bone-crushing thud, the woman was thrown aside, and Alphonse's field of vision filled with the night sky. Free from the woman's grasping fingers, he coughed furiously. sucking in as much fresh air as his tortured throat could manage. "Are you all right?" asked a clear voice behind him. The source of it was a second woman, who he was certain had not been there moments ago.
Uh-oh. A good vampire.
I keep doing that. Okay. He was certain had not been there a moment ago. She wore a navy blue overcoat, paired with a matching navy beret. Her ash blonde hair reached as far as her neck, and her features were dignified, as though they still retained clear vestiges of childhood innocence. At a guess, she seemed roughly the same age as Alphonse himself.
Of course.
Naturally. Still busy processing the recent events. I mean, we're guessing he's probably, what, about 18, 19?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, young soldier age.
Young soldier,
age.
Yeah. He and the girl at the inn have known each other about a decade, so they're probably late teens, early 20s, if that.
Yeah.
Okay. Still busy processing the recent events, Alphonse made no reply to her query. The woman watched him for some time before coolly stating, "You appear to be mostly uninjured, at least. I'm glad you have survived in time. I'm glad to have arrived in time." Seemingly satisfied he would survive, she turned away and studied the crumpled form of the woman who attacked him. "That," she said with a note of distaste, "is a ghoul. A thing a person becomes after their blood has been drained by a vampire." Okay, so vampires exist, and vampires turn people into ghouls. Interesting.
And vampire hunters. That's the same as Rosario Vampire, what's it called?
The
Rosario
manga?
Vampire anime. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she's basically Van Helsing at this point.
Yeah.
As she spoke, she kicked her left heel against the ground, her left boot against the ground. The tap, tap seemed to punctuate each word. It appeared to be the boot she had used to kick the woman, ghoul, away from him. As he followed the restless drumming of her boot, he suddenly thought, "Vampire? I have no issue with you idling about, but I would prefer if you stood aside before doing so. You are in my way." Her words were sharp, but no sooner had she said them than a creaking sound filled the area. The ghoul, which had been motionless on the ground while they were talking, was now slowly rising. Its contorted body lifted from the cobblestones using only the power of its legs. That's kind of impressive.
Yeah.
It was a grotesque spectacle and utterly unnatural. And if the ghoul was bothered by the earlier blow, it showed no sign. Without warning, the ghoul suddenly kicked at the ground like a wild beast and propelled itself towards them. Alphonse jerked to his feet and leapt forward to shield the blonde woman. The exact moment that the ghoul's nails reached Alphonse, the blonde woman calmly reached her hand into her overcoat. In one smooth motion, she drew something out of it. It was a long, thin rapier. Its surface was a radiant silver polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the smoldering glow of the red moon. I have to say, the music really sets the mood for this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's good that we chose to do this now. Without a moment's hesitation, she thrust the rapier forward. Its pointed end flew past his neck, piercing the ghoul's throat effortlessly. With an equally smooth motion, she withdrew the blade. The ghoul fell to the ground and didn't move again. The menacing aura it had been radiating dissipated into nothing. Alphonse stood fixated to the spot, dumbfounded by what he had just witnessed. A small trickle of blood ran down his neck where the rapier had grazed it. "I do believe that I told you to stand aside. I suppose you must not have heard me." Sighing, she shook the ghoul's blood from her weapon before returning it to her scabbard. "After all, if you had heard me and acted that way regardless, I would be forced to conclude that you are most foolish indeed." Her blunt words and composed expression finally brought Alphonse to his senses. I was just trying to keep you from getting hurt. But never mind that. What's going on here anyway? Who are you? And why was that woman trying to..." He had intended to finish his sentence with the words, "eat me," but the possibility of what might have been was too terrifying to voice. What was clear to him was that the woman before him had saved his life and stabbed the ghoul to do so. Looking at Alphonse's confused expression as he wrestled with the situation, she gave a resigned sigh. "You appear to be a member of the military. I presume, then, that you are familiar with the so-called vampire murders?" Yeah, of course." Well then, if I were to tell you that that those vampire murders really are the work of a vampire, would you believe me? Alphonse gaped at her. What? Without answering, she turned away from him and walked over to the ghoul. Gently, she lifted it from the ground so Alphonse could get a good look at the face. What had been a terrifying creature just moments ago was now a woman again. Her expression was completely peaceful. It was hard to believe that she was the same woman who had attacked him earlier. Look closely here, the blonde woman instructed. She pointed at the corpse's neck, specifically at the 2 red dots on its surface. They were completely consistent with the marks on all of the other victims of the vampire murders. Certainly looks like a vampire bite, wouldn't you say? She said this as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Alphonse was still puzzled, but she ignored him and continued. Vampires who die as a result of having their blood sucked by a vampire become ghouls, who then try to feast on other humans. This sword, she said, tapping the scabbard, has been blessed by the church and is capable of putting them to rest. Her words brought the bizarre spectacle he had just witnessed back to the front of the mind. While he was interested in the church part of the statement, he had more pressing questions to ask. You're seriously saying that this was the work of a vampire? You really expect me to believe something that ridiculous? Whether you choose to believe it or not, it is the truth. A very unfortunate truth, but the truth, nonetheless, she said in the same cool, disinterested tone. Alphonse struggled with it. The truth as she presented it beggared belief. And yet, everything she said added up, and seemed consistent. It was equally hard to believe everything was a lie. He subconsciously touched his throat. The ache there only bolstered her position. He found himself willing to believe her. There is a vampire in this city. Of that I am certain. And I, she continued, placing her hand to her chest, am here to put an end to it. A period of silence followed. Undeterred, the woman began to talk again. Still, this is not ordinarily a matter that laymen should get involved with. So I recommend that you forget all you have seen and heard here. And I would prefer, she added, with a meaningful glance, if you kept all of this to yourself as well. She turned to walk away. Wait, he called out to her. Swallowing, he stood a little straighter. Will you allow me to help you? The blonde woman came to an abrupt halt. She turned her head to look at him. It was clear his sudden question had caught her completely off guard. Had caught her off guard. Wow. Slowly, she faced him completely. Well, I certainly wasn't expecting you to propose something quite that ludicrous. What could I possibly stand to gain by allowing you to help me? Her tone was sharp as ever, but Alphonse was unfazed. Around 10 years ago, both of my parents were killed. They died the exact same way as the victims of the vampire murders. Shock showed through the woman's normally blank expression. Alphonse continued. I don't remember much about that day, but there's one thing I can't forget. One thing I'll never be able to forget. As he spoke, the memory returned vividly to him. Roughly 10 years ago, Alphonse and his family had lived in a village in a remote region of the Empire. His father was a member of the army, serving in a unit stationed nearby, but it was an uneventful post, and they lived a quiet life. It was as normal and peaceful an existence as one could have until that fateful day when Alphonse returned from playing outside. It was then that he saw a sight that would be burned in his memories, his dreams, forever. There, in his home, he found the corpses of his parents, lying in a room stained with blood. Their bodies had been drained, and their necks were marked by strange bites. Yes. The incident was so unpleasant and bizarre that even then, there were those willing to believe, who believed that it was the work of a vampire. The army had conducted an investigation, but were unable to find any clues that would lead them to a suspect, and eventually the case was deemed unsolvable. Left with no family, Alphonse was taken in by his father's best friend and fellow soldier in the army, Gerard, and ended up living in Heimdall, and working. If what she said was true, and vampires really did exist, then maybe one was actually responsible for his parents' deaths. From the look on her face, it seemed she too thought it could be the case. Alphonse shook his head, though it was more for himself. It doesn't really matter if it was the worker of a vampire or not. I feel as though by solving this case, I'll finally be able to move on from that day. What happened that day? That's why. Another long silence fell between them. The blonde woman seemed deep in thought, and Alphonse waited patiently for her reply. Eventually, she let out a short sigh. As part of the army, you have access to restricted information on the murders. Perhaps your assistance might allow me to find the vampire more quickly. She put her hand in her coat and took out...
What happens to ghouls if they eat people? I'm guessing they don't also turn into ghouls otherwise.
No, but that's probably how they get their sustenance.
Yeah. So they'd be able to just keep killing.
They've been drained of their blood, so they need to consume blood to sustain themselves. She put her hand inside her coat and took out a short sword with the same silvery glow as the rapier she had used earlier. This will allow you to fight against ghouls and vampires. If you'll be cooperating with me, I expect you to protect yourself. Alphonse glanced at her face. Her expression clearly said she wouldn't brook any nonsense. His resolve would need to be firm and unwavering, and he would need to be prepared to encounter more ghouls like the one from before. Furthermore, he would have to be ready to face the vampire that lurked in the city, once and for all. With a resolute air, he accepted the sword, really more of a dagger, from her. My name's Alphonse, but everyone calls me Al. Everyone just calls me Al. The blonde woman looked down at her now empty hand, and the corners of her lips quirked up slightly. She raised the edges of the skirt underneath her coat and gave a respectful curtsy. My name is Rose. I imagine that our time together will be brief, but I look forward to working with you nonetheless. And that's where we get Red Moon Rose. Alright. So that was more interesting. I'm still not a fan of Al, but he's growing on me a little bit, and Rose seems interesting, if interesting in that way that non-protagonists tend to be interesting. I think. Anyway, I am going to run and grab a glass of water real quick, so I will be right back.
Alright.